The wind came down from the Bitterroot Mountains like a judgment, cold, sharp, full of old voices. It rattled the shutters of the cabin where Clara Dunn lived alone and hissed beneath the door like a thing searching for a way in. She sat by the hearth, one hand curled around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold, the other resting on the mended knee of her trousers. Her boots were still damp from the woodpile. Snow fell in a steady hush beyond the windows, erasing the land in white forgetfulness. It had been 6 years since she buried Eli. The boy had been 10 when the fever took him, his small hands clutching hers even after he could no longer speak. He'd been the only thing in this world she hadn't ruined, and she hadn't been able to keep him. After that, Clara had turned her back on the town, on the gossip and the pity, and on the God whose silence had become too loud to bear. The cabin had once belonged to her husband's grandfather, a place meant for summer hunting trips and trapping lines, not long winters or a woman with a hollow in her chest where her heart used to be. But it was far and quiet, and no one came unless they had reason. Clara liked it that way. Her days were all habit now, chopping wood, boiling beans, checking the snares she set down by the creek. Her hair had turned gray at the temples, and her face bore the lines of years spent bracing against loss and weather alike. That morning she'd found one of her traps empty, its metal sprung and bloodied, but nothing inside. She reset it with a frown, boots crunching in the snow, watching the heavy clouds roll in from the west. A storm, likely, the kind that lingered. She'd already brought in enough wood for 3 days, but still, she'd gone back for more. It was the only thing to do when you couldn't bear to sit still. Now she stared at the fire without seeing it, her mind elsewhere, on a red-cheeked boy with pine needles in his hair, on the sound of his laughter echoing off the trees. Her throat ached with the memory of it. A knock startled her. Clara stood slowly. No one came out here, not unless they were lost or meant trouble. She picked up the rifle from the wall, thumbed back the hammer out of old habit, and opened the door just wide enough to peer out. A man stood in the snow. He was slouched and half-covered in frost, the fur of his collar crusted with ice. His eyes were dark, sunken with exhaustion, and blood was smeared down the side of his leg. A pack hung from his shoulder, sagging with wet. "Sorry," he rasped. "Didn't mean to scare you. My horse went down in the gulch. Been walking near 10 miles. Clara said nothing, eyes sharp. "Name Nathaniel Reed," he added, teeth chattering now. "I ain't looking for nothing but a place to ride out the storm." There was a silence between them, long enough for the wind to scream again through the trees. Clara studied his face, the raw honesty of his desperation, the way he swayed slightly on his feet. He was no threat now. He wouldn't last the night out here, not in that condition. Finally, she opened the door wider. "You'll leave when the storm breaks," she said, not a question. He nodded, "Yes, ma'am." She stepped aside and he limped in, shedding snow and cold like a dog shakes off water. The cabin filled with the scent of sweat, blood, and the wild. Clara closed the door behind him and bolted it. "Sit," she ordered, gesturing toward the fire. Nathaniel obeyed, groaning softly as he lowered himself onto the floor near the hearth. He held his hands out to the heat, fingers trembling. Clara fetched a basin and clean cloth, then knelt beside him to examine the gash along his thigh. It was ugly but not deep, a branch maybe, or a rock slide. He didn't flinch as she cleaned it, just watched her with tired eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly when she wrapped the wound. She didn't answer. She poured him coffee and ladled beans into a tin bowl. As he ate, she sat across from him, arms crossed, watching the snow deepen beyond the small panes of glass. For the first time in years, the cabin did not feel quite so silent. And Clara, though she wouldn't name the feeling, felt something shift inside her like spring ice cracking underfoot. A stranger's need had crossed her threshold. And she had let him in. Morning crept in without color. The storm had passed but left a sky the color of old bones, and a stillness so profound even the birds seemed to have stayed quiet in their trees. Clara stood at the window with her arms wrapped around herself, watching frost slither across the pane. Behind her, the fire crackled low and steady. Nathaniel was still asleep, curled beneath the old quilt she'd laid out on the floor. His breath came slow and shallow, and the lines of his face had softened in rest. In the night, he'd cried out once, a strangled sound like a man drowning. Clara hadn't moved. She'd heard enough of grief in dreams to know not to wake it too harshly. She dressed quietly, pulling on her coat and boots. There were traps to check, and she needed to see if the creek had frozen over. Before she stepped out, she placed another log on the fire and left a tin of water warming beside it. Outside, the world was sharp and glittering. Snow hung heavy on the branches, and the sky held that pale hush of something waiting to happen. Clara moved with practiced ease, boots crunching over the crusted snow, her breath rising in small clouds. She found the first trap snapped and empty again. She crouched beside it, fingers brushing the faint tracks leading away, fox most likely, smart one. She reset the trap, brushing snow off her gloves, and stood. Then she saw it, another set of tracks, bigger, human. Clara straightened, eyes narrowing. The tracks didn't come from the cabin. They angled in from the west, shallow and staggering, as if someone had been moving through the snow with great difficulty. They stopped not far from where she stood. At a tree, blood marked the bark. She followed them a few paces more before they vanished, buried, maybe, or covered on purpose. Clara returned to the cabin with a weight between her shoulders she couldn't shake. Nathaniel was sitting up when she stepped inside, the quilt drawn around his shoulders. He looked better, though his face still bore the paleness of pain and long fatigue. "Smells like snow's done," he said. "It is," Clara replied, setting her rifle against the wall. She busied herself with kindling, feeding the fire until it leapt brighter. "You went out." She nodded, "Traps." He hesitated, "Something wrong." Clara looked at him for a long beat. "You come from the west." He blinked, surprised. "Yeah, why?" "I found tracks," she said evenly. "Someone else was out there, near the creek." Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "Could have been someone following me. I didn't look back much once the horse went down, just kept moving." She studied him. He didn't flinch under her gaze. "You runnin' from something." A pause, then he answered, not with words, but with his silence, his mouth drawing into a tight line. That was answer enough. Clara didn't press. Everyone who ended up this far from town was running from something. Some just hid it better. Later, while he slept again, she sat by the hearth and stitched a tear in her coat. Her fingers moved through the fabric with the ease of long practice, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on blood against bark, on footprints that ended too soon. When Nathaniel woke again, it was near dusk. "You got someone," he asked quietly, "back in town?" Clara shook her head without looking up. "No." "Me neither." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Not quite. "You lose someone?" he asked after a while, so gently it didn't feel like prying. She paused, her needle stilled. "Yes," she said. Nathaniel didn't ask more, and somehow that was the kindest thing he could have done. That night she made rabbit stew from a catch that had waited in the cold shed. They ate in silence, the fire warm between them. Snow slipped quietly from the roof, and the wind had turned soft. When Clara looked at Nathaniel again, she didn't see a stranger so much as a fellow survivor. A man marked by sorrow, walking the same long road she'd been on since the earth took her boy. Neither of them said it, but something had changed. Not much. Just a quiet shift, like the first green bud beneath thawing snow. By the third day, Nathaniel was strong enough to split kindling. Clara stood at the cabin's edge, her breath fogging the glass as she watched him work. He moved with a slight limp but bore the axe with sure hands, his breath puffing out in little huffs each time the blade hit wood. He didn't talk much, not while working, not even when she brought him water or pointed out a better swing. Clara didn't ask where he'd learned. She didn't need to. There were other small changes now. He started clearing his own plate, folding the quilt each morning, stepping out to fetch snow from melting before she even mentioned it. She noticed these things the way one notices spring creeping up, a patch of brown grass revealed beneath the thaw, the sudden chatter of a wren. That night she found herself leaving the door unlatched after he stepped out to the privy, not by mistake, just not locking it. The tracks she'd seen near the creek still troubled her. Each day she went out a little farther, her rifle always over one shoulder, eyes scanning the trees. Once, she saw the faint impression of a boot heel pressed into new snow, pointed away from her land. Nothing since. Nathaniel watched her more closely now, not with suspicion, but like a man used to checking the skies for weather. "You expecting trouble?" he asked one morning as she returned with a brace of grouse. "I'm used to it," she said, and passed him the birds. He cleaned them without complaint, though she noticed his hands trembled slightly. Cold or nerves. That evening, as dusk stretched long shadows across the walls, Clara finally asked what had been pressing at her since the first day. "You said you weren't looking for anything but shelter," she began. Nathaniel glanced up from where he sat oiling his boots. "I meant it." She nodded slowly. "But someone's out there, tracks weren't old, and you said you didn't look back much." He was quiet a moment, then set the oil rag down. "There was a man," he said, "in Wyoming, a foreman, mean one, took what he wanted and left the rest bleeding. I saw him do things I should have stopped, didn't, not in time." He looked away, jaw tight. "There was a boy," he added, voice low, "not more'n 12, didn't speak English, just followed his father wherever they went. The foreman—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I tried to stop it, too late." Clara's breath caught. She stared at him across the flickering lamplight. "I put a bullet in that man," Nathaniel said. "Didn't wait to see if he bled out, just ran." "You think someone chasing you?" "Could be, friend of his or someone else wants payback. Word travels." Clara looked down at her hands. They bore the map of her own battles, calluses, small scars, the faint burn mark from when she dropped a kettle in the first winter alone. "I lost my son to fever," she said at last, her voice as steady as a still pond. "But I know the kind of men who do the talkin', seen them up close. I don't begrudge you what you did." Nathaniel didn't thank her. He just nodded once, as if her words had built a step beneath him, something solid. The next morning, Clara found a dead crow nailed to the fence. The blood had soaked through the wood and frozen there, black and glistening. No animal had done it. The wings were stretched deliberately, twisted just enough to mock. She took it down without a word, burned it in the stove. When Nathaniel saw the ashes, he didn't ask. But that night, he cleaned her rifle along with his own. Whatever road they were walking, it wasn't solitary anymore. And whatever was coming, they would face it together. The days grew longer, just barely. Snow still covered the earth, but it no longer fell with the same relentlessness. It melted at the edges of the cabin where the sun lingered, exposing patches of brown earth and the first shy blades of grass. The wind still bit, but less cruelly now, like something remembering gentleness. Clara had begun to speak more, not much, but enough. She told Nathaniel about the way Eli used to build forts out of pine branches, how he believed every rock along the creek bed had a spirit. She talked of the fever only once and never used the word death. Just said, "He stopped breathing in my arms," and left it there between them like a stone placed on a grave. Nathaniel listened like the telling mattered. He never interrupted, never offered the kind of comfort that came cheap. He just listened, and sometimes that was more than enough. He was fixing the hinge on the door when the shot rang out. A single crack, sharp and clear, not distant. Clara dropped the kettle and grabbed her rifle before it hit the floor. Nathaniel was already at the window, ducked low. "Ridge," he muttered, "east side, about 200 yards." She looked, movement in the trees, just a flicker. "Who'd be out there?" Nathaniel's mouth set into a grim line. Same kind of man who nails birds to fences. They didn't talk about fear. It was there, but it didn't show itself loud. Clara handed Nathaniel his coat, then took down the revolver she kept hidden behind the hearthstones. She hadn't touched it in years. Her hand trembled only once. They didn't sleep that night, took turns watching the dark. By morning, the man had moved on, but the message was clear. He was watching. The next few days passed with the tight feel of waiting for something to break. Clara checked the snares in pairs now, Nathaniel always walking a few paces behind, his eyes scanning the trees. Once, they found boot tracks again, circling near the creek. Another day, a rusted trap reset with a rabbit inside, but the rabbit had been gutted, left arranged like a warning. Nathaniel said, "He's not hunting game." Clara nodded, "He's hunting fear." They talked finally about leaving, heading to town, telling the sheriff. But the nearest law was 3 days' ride in decent weather, and there was no guarantee they'd find anything but a shrug and a cold bed in the jailhouse. "This man," Clara said as they sat by the fire, "he wants us gone, but more than that, he wants to break us before he tries." Nathaniel didn't answer right away. Then, I'm not going to run anymore. Clara met his eyes. Neither am I. They began to prepare. The traps were reset, not for animals this time, but for men. Nathaniel rigged a bell above the door and taught Clara how to string line through the trees for early warning. They set up a perch in the loft with a clear shot to the ridge, and Clara practiced with the rifle until her shoulder ached. But it wasn't all grim. In the quiet hours they talked, about books they had read long ago, about songs their mothers used to hum. Nathaniel told her about the horse he lost, how it had been more companion than beast. Clara told him about the time Eli found a turtle and named it Kingsley. For a moment, they both laughed. That night she fell asleep beside him, not touching, just near enough to feel his warmth through the quilt. It was the first night she'd slept without dreams. Then, one morning, Clara stepped out to gather wood and found a name carved into the side of the cabin. Reed. Cut clean and deep. The firewood dropped from her hands. Nathaniel came out fast, rifle in hand. He saw the name, his jaw tightening. Now he's calling me out, he said. Clara looked past him to the tree line, to the silence that had grown louder. She touched the carved letters, cold, rough, deliberate. He'll come soon, she said. Nathaniel's voice was a whisper. Then we'll be ready. The sun rose without warmth, a thin smear of gold behind the pines. Frost clung to every surface like breath held too long. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, its embers pulsing dim red, but Clara didn't rise to feed it. She sat in the loft, rifle across her knees, eyes on the ridge. Nathaniel paced below, checking traps, boiling water, moving through the cabin like a man preparing not for a battle, but for a reckoning. They both felt it, the stillness, the way the forest held its breath. Even the birds had gone silent. Near mid-morning, the bell above the door trembled once. Then a second time. Clara saw him first, a man in a long coat, the kind worn for trailing or bounty hunting. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but his gait was slow, sure, not rushed, a man who knew he was expected. He stepped just past the trees, then paused, hand resting near his hip. He didn't call out, didn't announce his name, just stood waiting to be seen. Nathaniel opened the door. "You looking for me?" he called. The man raised his head. "You Reed?" "I am. You know why I'm here." Nathaniel stepped out into the snow. Clara held her breath. She could shoot now, he was in range, but something told her this moment needed breath, not bullets. "I reckon I do," Nathaniel answered. The man nodded once. "He was my brother, the one you shot." Nathaniel's voice was low. He was killing a child. "Still my kin. That boy was innocent." "Don't matter," the man said. "Blood calls to blood." Clara watched as Nathaniel stepped down from the porch. "Then take your shot," Nathaniel said. "But know this, if I could go back, I'd do it again." A long silence stretched between them. Snow shifted from the trees in slow curtains. The wind held no judgment. The man didn't draw. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a flask. He unscrewed the cap, took a long drink, then turned his face to the trees. "I followed you near 60 miles, he said. "Thought I'd find some outlaw holed up like a rat, not a man fixing hinges and sleeping beside a woman." Nathaniel didn't move. Heard what happened from folks in Casper, heard the boy lived, that he's safe. He looked at Nathaniel, long and hard. "I won't forgive you, but I won't kill you." Then he turned, walked back into the woods, and was gone. Nathaniel didn't speak for a long time. When he came back inside, he dropped his coat on the hook and stood in front of the fire, hands shaking just slightly. Clara descended from the loft. "He's gone," she said. He nodded. "You could have let me shoot." "I know. Why didn't you?" Nathaniel looked at her then, eyes full of something that had no name. "Because this place, this life, it gave me something worth not running from." Clara stepped closer. "And you," he added, voice hoarse, "you gave me something worth standing still for." The fire popped softly. Clara touched his arm, just a brush, but he leaned into it and it was enough. In the days that followed, the land began to thaw in earnest. The creek ran louder. The birds returned. Clara planted seeds in the small patch of earth beside the porch, while Nathaniel repaired the fence. They spoke little of that day. It had passed like a storm, sharp, terrifying, but brief. In its place came quiet, peace, even, not the kind that forgets, but the kind that makes room for grief beside the living. One evening, Clara pulled down the tin box where she kept Eli's drawings. She hadn't opened it in years. She placed it on the table and sat across from Nathaniel. "Want to see who you remind me of?" she asked, her voice soft. He nodded, and they went through the pages together, crude pencil sketches of trees and birds, a crooked sun, and always, always her. When they finished, he touched her hand and didn't let go. That night she slept beside him again. This time, their hands entwined, resting between them like a prayer. Spring came fully at last. And though Clara would always carry the ache of her boy, something new bloomed within her, quiet, resilient, like the crocus pushing through thawed soil. Not salvation, but kindness, recognition, and a reason to wake with the dawn.